Well, good morning, Vaughn. We're speaking the morning before Election Day on Friday. As we've seen in the latest Leger poll, and I know you've heard from both parties, this is a very close race coming down to the wire. So I don't know, maybe some advice for our armchair viewers. We sit down in front of our TVs at 8 o'clock tomorrow. The results start coming in. What will you be looking for in some of those early returns to sort of indicate how things are going for either party?
Well, the first thing that's going to be very interesting tomorrow night, I spoke to a conference here in Victoria last night with Elections BC, and they're saying that the technology is such now that they should have close to final results within an hour. So if they're right and they've tested the technology here in by-elections and elsewhere, it's been tested. If they're right and it's not super close, we may not have very long to sit around. You might not want to leave the TV and go and get yourself a drink if it's like that. So that's the first thing.
Interesting. Okay.
The second thing is I've covered 10 provincial elections and there's nothing quite like this one. So, I mean, you've got three things going on here. One is the NDP, David Eby, trying to win a third term. New Democrats have never managed to win three in a row here in BC, or well, they sort of won in 2017, ended up in government, and then won in 2020. So this is a precedent-setting experience for them. You've got David Eby running against a political party that barely existed when he got the job as premier 2 years ago. So the Conservatives haven't won a seat in BC on their own since 1978. They haven't formed a government since the 1920s. So again, very unusual. And the third unusual thing, and I think we viewers and listeners and readers are going to be looking at, what happens with the independents. We have a number of people who were incumbent members of the legislature when the legislature was dissolved for this election, who are running as independents. And so we really have nothing to go by on that. We've had one person elected to the legislature in modern times as an independent. She did it twice, Vicky Huntington. The first time she won by 10 votes. So we don't know how the independents are going to do. It's going to be fascinating to watch them. The other thing at that conference I spoke at last night, also speaking, was the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, Janet Austin. And I said to her, I hope you have an interesting election night, but maybe not as interesting as your predecessor, Judith Guichon, had in 2017, because there was somebody at the conference who told me that they'd been in the room with Guichon in 2017 as the votes came in. And of course, that is close election, dead heat in the seat count, almost, dead heat in the vote count, almost. And they said the interesting thing was everyone else in the room was just riveted to the TV. But Guichon was more and more somber because she realized this whole thing was going to end up in her lap. So I said to Lieutenant Governor Austin last night, I said, I hope you have an interesting night. Maybe not that interesting, but I'm sure she'll make the right decision if she has to do it, as Guichon did in 2017. So this, BC specializes in this. Really interesting elections, the occasional eruption that occurs where the parties reorganize themselves. And, it's going to be fascinating on election night. It may be fast forward, as I say, because if they're right about how quickly the returns come in, we could be a result fairly quickly.
Now, we know today being the last sort of full campaign day that Eby's crisscrossing the Lower Mainland. Rusted's doing the same kind of thing in Metro Vancouver. You said from the outset, and the parties were saying, that battleground Metro Vancouver, is that still what we're looking at?
Sure, but I think it's really interesting that Eby spent a whole day campaigning on Vancouver Island this week. Started at North Island and came all the way down here to Victoria. Look, in the past, the New Democrats have taken Vancouver Island for granted, for good reason. They won nearly every seat here, except for one or two that went to the Greens. The premier seriously campaigned, as I said, from the north end of the island, in and around Nanaimo, down to Victoria. That tells us that the NDP polls are showing the NDP, these are the internal polls, that they're having to fight to hang on to some of their seats on Vancouver Island. And I think, again, for the viewer, we're going to be looking at what happens in Victoria Beacon Hill. That's where I'm coming to you from the moment. That's the riding that includes the legislature buildings. It was a long time represented by Carol James of the NDP, as now represented by a cabinet minister, Grace Lohr. But this is a three-way fight in Victoria. She's fighting to hang on.
Sonia Furstenau, the leader of the Greens, is running there as well.
That is the reason that seat is in play, I think. Furstenau, the Greens tend to do well on the island, but I think, a lot of voters, I think, are going, well, it'd be nice to have the Greens in the legislature, right? And the New Democrats have been warning Green, British Columbians, especially island residents, especially Victorians, don't be tempted to vote for the Greens, right? Because it's really a vote for John Rustad and the Conservatives. Well, Harold, parties are incredibly hypocritical on the issue of vote splitting. They celebrate every division on the other side of the political spectrum, and they tell the people on their own side, I know this Furstenau woman, she's very nice, but don't be fooled. You're really voting for John Rustad when you vote.
Right.
We're going to be looking at the Greens, again, for election night. Greens need to win 2 seats to retain official party status in the legislature. Right. That means a piece of the action in question period. It means research money. It means staffing money. So it really matters to get official party status. They need 2 seats. Obviously, they would like their leader's seat here in Victoria to be one of them. They've got their eyes on Saanich North and the islands. That was where Adam Olsen was the MLA, Rob Botterill running there. And around the province, there's the West Van riding that goes up to Whistler. Let's see, where else? Oh, Southern Interior, Kootenay Central, I gather. They're persuaded they've got a piece of the action there. So that'll really be important. The independents will be important. And if all of those people manage to get themselves elected, we might be into a situation where neither the New Democrats nor the Conservatives managed to win a majority of seats. We could be into the 2017 scenario where the parties have to work something out.
You mentioned the Green factor. I know they're obviously not running a full slate this time, and in some ridings, they're not even where they are running candidates. They're not particularly active. But someone was telling me the other day that in Surrey, for example, where you now have 10 ridings, half of the ridings they're running Greens and half do not have Green candidates. So does that, again, if you talk battleground Surrey, does that give the NDP a little bit of an advantage in those ones without Green candidates, or is that too simple?
Well, if there's no Green candidate in the riding, the people inclined to vote Green might not show up and vote. They might decide instead to vote for an independent. The New Democrats are gambling, anticipating is the right word, anticipating that if there's no Green candidate, the Green voter, the Green-leaning voter, is more likely to vote NDP than for anybody else. And that may well be the case in some close races. I know the Conservatives were disappointed and the New Democrats were happy that the Greens fell well short of a full slate of candidates this time. There's 24 ridings where they're not running anyone.
Vaughn, you mentioned Grace Lohr on the island, a cabinet minister who's in a bit of a fight. Any other NDP cabinet ministers in tough?
Yeah, the New Democrats are worried that, even if they form a majority, they're not going to do as well as they did in 2020 during the pandemic election. They think their vote will fall off and they expect to lose a few members. And so they're paying very close attention to Langley, Chilliwack, Maple Ridge, and in each case, along with Victoria, in each case, it's just a riding that the party won last time, but they're not sure their vote will hold. They've also had some retirements. A number of ministers have decided not to run again. Incumbent ministers give you a profile in a riding, and unknowns are a bit more challenging. So the reason they're spending a lot of time in Surrey is because Surrey has so many seats. They're spending a fair amount of time in Richmond because they took a bunch of seats last time in Richmond for the first time, and they want to hang on to them. But, the NDP has a worst case scenario for them. I mean, at least the only one they'll admit to is they lose a half dozen seats, maybe get down to just a slim majority of the seats in the House. Maybe they go as low as 48, 49, 50 seats. And I think what they're looking at is they expect to win. They think they're going to have to fight hard to get out the vote effort. And I guess in the back of their minds, they're not going to get caught the way they did in 2013 without having a concession speech ready. They're recognizing that you might lose. The odds are against it, but they might lose.
Okay. And for the Conservatives, I mean, they do have some former BC United incumbents running, and then of people like Sturco who defected to the Conservative Party. I would think that John Rustad needs some of those folks to win if he were to even form an effective opposition, get some experienced MLAs back in.
Yeah, and there probably are a few cranks and crackpots that he wouldn't be completely devastated if they didn't get elected, because then he wouldn't have to deal with it. But yes, to form a government, if Rustad forms a government, and as I said, I think the odds are against it, but if he does, we are going to be immediately doing stories on who's qualified to be in cabinet. And you're right, we'll pick the people that have experience. They have some people running that were MLAs in the last House under a different label. And they have some candidates they've managed to attract that are fairly impressive. So it'll be a new government. And I think we saw during the campaign, Harold, that to be generous about it, the Conservatives were trying to build a political party at the same time as they were trying to win an election. And no wonder there was a scramble. We saw it with their platform. We saw it with the lack of vetting of some of their candidates. We saw it with how Rustad wasn't especially well prepared for the debate. And so, if they make it, if they manage to persuade enough people that they're ready to govern, putting together that government is going to be a challenge as well.
All right. Well, that's great, Vaughn. Look forward to your coverage on Saturday night, your analysis of the results, if they do come in as quickly as Elections BC hopes. And we'll talk again next week.